The restaurant was alive with the sound of clinking glasses and hushed conversations as the dinner rush reached its peak. Tuxedo-clad waiters weaved through the tables with practiced precision, balancing trays laden with dishes that glistened under the warm light. Amid the buzz, one particular corner of the restaurant exuded an aura of quiet elegance, a space reserved for those who didn't just dine but made an impression. It was the kind of place where everyone dressed to the nines and exclusivity was as much on the menu as the gourmet cuisine. Lucille O'Neal entered the restaurant with her head held high, her posture exuding grace and confidence. She wasn't a celebrity or a high-profile figure in the traditional sense, but there was something about her, a quiet dignity, a self-assured presence that commanded attention. She wore a simple yet elegant outfit, her smile warm but reserved as she approached the maitre d'. She had come for a meal, like anyone else, not realizing this evening would unravel into an unforgettable story. The maitre d' greeted her with a polite nod, but the flicker of hesitation in his eyes didn't escape Lucille. He gestured for her to follow, leading her to a corner table where she could enjoy her meal in peace. As she settled into her seat and picked up the menu, the faint murmurs of other diners and the soft melody of the piano provided a pleasant backdrop. Everything seemed perfect until her waiter arrived. At first glance, the waiter seemed like any other staff member, efficient, polished, and quick with a practiced smile. But when his eyes met Lucille's, something shifted. His demeanor changed, almost imperceptibly at first, but enough for Lucille to notice. He stiffened, his smile faltering as he spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his tone clipped, "I'm afraid there's been a mistake. This table is reserved for someone else." Lucille blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. "I was seated here by the maitre d'. Is there an issue?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The waiter hesitated, glancing around as if searching for support. "It's just that we have certain expectations here. Perhaps another table might be more appropriate." The words hung in the air like an unwelcome chill, and Lucille felt their sting. She wasn't naive, she knew what he meant, even if he didn't say it outright. The insinuation was clear, and it was the kind of subtle exclusion that spoke volumes without needing to shout. Lucille could have argued, could have made a scene, but she chose a different path. With quiet resolve, she rose from her seat, her eyes never leaving the waiter's. "I see," she said, her tone even. "Thank you for clarifying." She left the restaurant without another word, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't the first time she faced such treatment, but it didn't sting any less. What the waiter didn't realize, what no one in that room could have anticipated, was who Lucille O'Neal was, and more importantly, who her son was. Hours later, the restaurant buzzed once again, but this time it wasn't just the usual chatter of diners. A low ripple of whispers spread through the room, heads turning toward the entrance as an unmistakable figure stepped inside. Towering above everyone else, his presence was impossible to ignore. It was Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, a man whose name was synonymous with greatness. And he wasn't there for the food. Shaquille's eyes scanned the room, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry, not yet, but there was a quiet intensity about him, the kind that silenced rooms and made even the most confident individuals second-guess themselves. The waiter from earlier froze, his face paling as realization dawned on him. This wasn't just any guest. This was Shaquille O'Neal. And he wasn't here to sign autographs or pose for photos. What happened next would leave the restaurant staff and its patrons reeling, a lesson in humility that would echo long after Shaquille and his mother left the scene. But as he approached the maitre d', his imposing frame towering over the stand, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a meal. It was about respect. What Shaquille O'Neal said next would change everything. Shaquille O'Neal stood in the entrance of the restaurant, his broad shoulders and towering frame casting a long shadow across the gleaming marble floor. The hum of conversation faltered as diners noticed him, their forks pausing midair and whispers breaking out like ripples in a pond. Some nudged their companions, pointing discreetly. Others fumbled for their phones, eager to capture the moment. But Shaquille wasn't here for a spectacle, and he wasn't in the mood for small talk. The maitre d', visibly flustered, forced a smile and stepped forward. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and nervousness. "It's such an honor to have you here. How can we?" Shaquille raised a hand, cutting him off. His expression remained calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "I'm looking for the waiter who served my mother earlier tonight," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of authority. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The maitre d' hesitated, his gaze darting toward the staff clustered near the kitchen doors. The waiter in question was among them, his face a shade paler than it had been earlier. He looked like a man who wished he could disappear into the floor. Shaquille's words weren't loud, but they carried an intensity that made everyone in the vicinity listen. Lucille O'Neal had always been the rock of her family, a woman of strength and grace who had raised her children to value kindness and integrity above all else. Shaquille had learned many lessons from her over the years, lessons about humility, perseverance, and treating everyone with respect, no matter their station in life. When Lucille had told her son about the incident at the restaurant, she hadn't done so to spark outrage or demand justice. She had simply shared her disappointment, her quiet sadness over being made to feel less than she was. That was enough to ignite something in Shaquille. The waiter was ushered forward reluctantly, his step slow and his head bowed. As he approached, Shaquille's imposing figure seemed to grow even taller. The room was so quiet now that even the faint clink of a glass being set down echoed like a drumbeat. "You're the one who refused to serve my mother," Shaquille said, his voice devoid of anger, but heavy with meaning. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a challenge to own up to what had been done. The waiter stammered, his words stumbling over each other in a rush. I didn't mean. I didn't know." His voice trailed off as he struggled to find an excuse that wouldn't make things worse. Shaquille took a slow step closer, leaning down slightly so his eyes were level with the waiter's. "Let me tell you something about my mom," he began, his tone calm but resolute. "She's the strongest person I know. She's been through things you can't even imagine, and she's come out of them with more grace and dignity than most people ever will. She doesn't need this place, and she doesn't need you. But you know what she does deserve. Respect." The waiter's face burned with embarrassment, and he mumbled an apology under his breath. But Shaquille wasn't finished. He straightened up, glancing around the room to ensure his words reached everyone present. "This isn't just about my mom," he continued. "It's about how we treat people, how we judge them before we even know their story. That kind of attitude doesn't belong anywhere, especially not here." The tension in the room was palpable, a collective holding of breath as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Shaquille's words carried a weight that no one could ignore. He wasn't yelling, wasn't throwing his fame around. He was simply speaking from the heart, and it was a powerful thing to witness. Lucille, who had returned quietly and stood near the entrance, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of pride and emotion. She hadn't asked for this confrontation, but seeing her son stand up for her and for what was right filled her heart in a way words couldn't express. As Shaquille turned to leave, he looked back at the maitre d'. "Make sure it doesn't happen again," he said simply. It wasn't a threat, just a piece of advice that carried the weight of a promise. The moment hung in the air as Shaquille and Lucille walked up together, leaving behind a room full of people who would remember that night not for the basketball star's visit, but for the lesson in respect and humility they had witnessed. But as the door closed behind them, the ripple effects of that moment were only just beginning. The waiter wasn't the only one reflecting on his actions, and the restaurant's reputation was now under the scrutiny of not just its diners, but the wider world beyond its doors. The restaurant's silence lingered long after Shaquille and Lucille O'Neal had left. The air felt heavy, not with blame, but with reflection. The maitre d', the staff, and the diners all seemed to replay the scene in their minds. For some, it was a moment of discomfort. For others, it was a call to action. The waiter, who had stood frozen as Shaquille spoke, now sat quietly in the staff area, his face buried in his hands. His regret was written all over him, but the weight of his actions couldn't be undone with a simple apology. Word of the incident spread quickly, as it often does in today's world. Some diners posted about it online, recounting the powerful words Shaquille had spoken and the grace with which his mother carried herself. The story resonated with people far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Comments poured in, with strangers sharing their own experiences of feeling dismissed or underestimated. It wasn't just a story about a celebrity standing up for his mother. It was a story about dignity, respect, and how much kindness matters in everyday life. For the restaurant, however, the fallout was immediate. Management called an emergency meeting the following day. The maitre d' led the discussion, his tone serious. "We pride ourselves on offering excellent service," he began, but last night we failed. Not just because of one waiter's actions, but because we allowed a culture of judgment to exist here. The waiter who had refused to serve Lucille stood to address the room. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I don't have an excuse," he admitted. "I made an assumption based on nothing but prejudice. I didn't just embarrass myself, I embarrassed all of us. And I'm sorry, truly." His apology was sincere, but the restaurant knew it needed more than words to make things right. Over the next few weeks, they implemented mandatory training on inclusivity and respect for all employees. They reached out to Lucille O'Neal with a formal apology, expressing their gratitude for her grace and their commitment to being better. While Lucille appreciated the gesture, she didn't dwell on the past. She believed in moving forward, in turning a moment of pain into an opportunity for growth. Shaquille, meanwhile, continued to reflect on the night. He knew his actions had made a difference, but he also knew that his mother had been the true hero of the story. "My mom doesn't need me to fight her battles," he told a reporter who asked about the incident. "She's been fighting them her whole life. But if I can use my voice to make sure no one else has to go through what she did, I'll do it every time." The story reached millions, not just because of Shaquille's fame, but because it touched on something universal. Everyone, at some point, has felt overlooked, underestimated, or unwelcome. The O'Neal story reminded people of the power of respect, the strength in standing up for what's right, and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. The restaurant slowly regained its reputation, not because of damage control, but because it genuinely changed. Regular patrons noticed the difference in the staff's attitude, the warmth in their service, and the way they treated every guest like they mattered. It became a place not just known for its fine dining, but for its commitment to fairness and humanity. As for Lucille and Shaquille, they never returned to the restaurant, but they didn't need to. The lesson had been learned, the change set in motion. And as they sat together one evening, sharing a meal at home, Lucille smiled at her son. "You know," she said, her voice full of warmth, "it wasn't about the food that night. It was about the bigger picture. And you helped people see that." Shaquille chuckled, his larger-than-life presence softening in the glow of his mother's pride. I learned from the best, he said, raising his glass in a toast. To respect. To you. And in that moment, the story found its true ending, not in the confrontation at the restaurant, but in the quiet strength of a mother and the unwavering love of a son.